It's part 2 of my Marvel Snap locations guide. We're going to talk about tips and tricks for the various locations in Marvel Snap. If you missed part 1, check out the link in the description. But for now, we're going to kick it off with Negative Zone. And for this one, it's really all about how many units you're going to be looking to put into play. Because if you go for 4 units with Negative Zone, that means it's a negative 12 debuff. Where if you just play like one bigger thing, you might only be realizing a negative 3 debuff. So keep in mind, if you're a deck that goes wide, has tons of low-cost units, might be a little quicker on the retreat for Negative Zone. Same advantage could apply, though, if your opponent is clearly a deck that's running like a lot of 1 and 2 cost units. They might have trouble outscaling Negative Zone, either making this a free location win for you, or something where you might want to snap early and force them to make some tough calls. Next up here is New York, and I think this is one of the toughest locations to master in all of Marvel Snap. Ideally, you don't want to play in this one early so that you leave yourself a lot of flexibility, being able to move here late, surprise your opponent, readjust stats, rebalance, etc. But if your opponent does the same, then this becomes a real tough call late in a game. How many units are they going to move to New York? How much do I need to commit? It's really just going to come down to feel. Sometimes, it just might be about raw stat total, like you just want to make sure you have more stats. That might be a favorable position on average, but your opponent could still sneak out and make good decisions and maybe undercommit to New York while you overcommit, and vice versa. And then, of course, you got to keep move synergy cards in mind as well, because they're going to naturally benefit from the move aspect of New York. Next up here is Nova Roma, which will draw you a card. And one card here is not a big change usually, but do keep in mind just the different shapes of decks. If you're playing against somebody who might be looking for a really specific synergy piece or some kind of combo setup, they're going to be more likely to have that, might make you more likely to lose. Alternatively, if you just, have a lot of low-cost cards, that person might benefit as well because they have the option to play more low-cost stuff when otherwise they might be emptying their hand a little bit too early. This could even be a downside for decks that are looking to end on an empty hand, say like with a strong guy, for instance, and this could make it a little bit more awkward for them to dump their hand in time. And then next up here, we have Olympia, and take everything I just said and magnify it by 2, because this one draws you 2 cards. One thing I didn't mention is hand buff cards, like Nakia, for instance. That can be an enormous advantage when you have a much larger hand, adding additional buff targets there. So if you're rocking a Nakia, this might be a good one to say, okay, look, I'm going to naturally gain an advantage here. Maybe I snap early. Or if you expect your opponent might, then they can certainly overwhelm you with all those extra hand buffs. Moving on to Onslaught's Citadel, ongoing effects here are doubled, and that can get pretty crazy if you're playing an Onslaught here. Other really powerful tools might be something like an Iron Man, even a Devil Dinosaur, although not quite as popular since it's nerf, still hangs around as well. And sometimes that can just be like a free win on this location if you're rocking a good ongoing card and your opponent's not. So that could be a great early snap indicator, but also keep in mind that surprises here, like that last turn Iron Man, even in something like a faster Khazar Zoo style deck, can absolutely blow this one wide open. So you got to be careful because the scaling potential on Onslaught Citadel is absolutely absurd. Next up, Sakar. Put a card from each player's hand here. And this one's one of those you just really have to judge in the moment. Sometimes this can be a huge advantage gained if you're able to like cheat out a really high cost card into Sakar for free. That can save you lots of energy to make bigger plays later. Could also be a little bit disruptive sometimes if like a combo piece gets ripped out, maybe even something like an Odin gets pulled and you were hoping to double some on reveal effects later. Suddenly that ability is gone, or a Heimdall gets pulled early and then your move synergies are gone. Those can be big risks or big advantages if they happen to your opponent. So just identify those key moments and make plays from there. Sanctum Sanctorum. Cards can't be played here, but notably they can still be added here. So if you have something like a Nightcrawler, you can just pop your Nightcrawler over with its move effect, and that might be enough to win Sanctum Sanctorum in some matchups. So that is a huge advantage. Also, cards that might summon things in other locations, say like a White Tiger, for instance, boom, that's a great way to win Sanctum Sanctorum. And if your opponent doesn't have anything to match, if they just don't have a way to add stats in a different location without playing cards, that might be a free win for you, a free lane win at least. And that can allow you to take a huge advantage for free. But do keep in mind some surprises late. Even like a Mr. Fantastic can come down and snipe Sanctum Sanctorum. So there are a lot of ways for people to pull this off as a surprise late in the game for sure. Next up here is Savage Land. Add 2 raptors on each side of this location, and raptors are just little 1 power units. And what that means is there's going to be a really tight fit here because you've only got 2 slots open for Savage Land, filling up half the board, which means if you have already committed a unit to this spot when it pops up, that means you might be really locked out of adding additional power there, or you might just not have a lot of room if you want to scale up, say, an Angela, for instance. Clearly, this is not going to be the spot to do that, so just be mindful of which units you put in this location, but also keep in mind that the total power of this location is going to be fairly low. So just one key big thing might make it really hard for your opponent to win that, especially if they're running a lot of smaller units instead. And don't forget that these are 1-cost units as well, so things like Kazar can buff these, which can be a nice little bonus surprise. Sewer system cards here have -1 power, and ultimately that's a pretty small change compared to something like we saw negative zone earlier in the video. This really doesn't tend to be as disruptive or add up quite as much. It's really one of those things you just kind of have to pay attention to the math. Don't forget when you're adding a unit here that it's going to lose that 1 power and kind of throw off your calculation. So this is more of one of those awareness checks, I think, than a drastically strategy altering kind of play, but just keep that in mind, especially around things like Iron Man, for instance, where it can throw the numbers off a little bit more than you might expect him going into negative stat totals. So next up is Shadowland. Add a ninja to each side with -2 power. So this is another one that restricts space a little bit, only leaving you 3 board spots, but perhaps more importantly is that -2 power. If you have some way to get rid of that, that can net you a tiny little incremental advantage over your opponent and gain you that board spot back as well. So any destroy effects like Carnage or Deathlock might be a nice way to open up that space, giving you a nice little lead on Shadowland. If you think you have those, your opponent doesn't, maybe even worth an early snap. Next up is Sinister London. I think this is one of the most fun locations in the entire game. When you play a card here, add a copy to another location. So here in particular, I think you want to put big bomb cards, high power output cards, things with crazy synergies like Iron Man, for instance. You toss those here and you're going to start building some ginormous boards. Now, the mistake I see some people play with this one is sometimes putting things that are a little too weak on Sinister London and not leaving them enough space later in the game to make more powerful plays. It can certainly be worth it with some early game cards. A Nakia getting double hand buffs, for instance, often is going to scale really nicely, especially when those stats are added to Sinister London, because keep in mind, any copied minions are still going to have on reveal effects, and they're also going to copy any buffed stats. So those are both nice things to keep in mind. But ultimately, I think you want to just maximize value here for Sinister London. In some cases, you may not even really have to play much for your other locations, because keep in mind, if you fill all 4 spots here, that is 8 total units. That leaves you only 4 additional spots throughout the course of the game. So you can't really play a lot of extra stuff. You kind of have to be very careful locking out your board places. So don't play like 5 things early and then hope to get the full value of Sinister London, because there won't be any spots left on that last play on London. So just really managing board space here and maximizing power per spot is going to go a long way for this one. Sokovia, discard a card from each player's hand. And this one's really just about paying attention. I always miss this because I'm like playing on my phone, watching TV with a wife. Sokovia hits. What did they discard? I don't even know. Sometimes I'm not even really paying enough attention to what I discard, especially if this is at the beginning of the game. But of course, if you do know, that can be a huge informational advantage. Oh, they lost some crazy combo piece. They lost their Mr. Negative. Their entire deck is going to be falling apart now. Without that Mr. Negative, it's going to be really hard for them to win. Early snap for sure, right? So just really being attentive, kind of deciding how impactful the discard is for you and your opponent can give you a lot of informational advantages leading forward. Stark Tower at the end of turn 5, give all cards here +2 power. So this is one of those where whoever has more cards here can really net a big advantage over the opponent, because if you've only committed 1 and your opponent's committed 4, that's a +6 in their favor. Might give them a really nice lead on Stark Tower. So you just want to make sure you're getting stuff here in time if you're planning to contest this location at all. You might decide to give it up and just let them take the bait, you know, and maybe overcommit to Stark Tower. But alternatively, you can use this to know when your opponent's going to play stuff. If you have any reactionary style cards like the Guardians of the Galaxy, say a Rocket Raccoon, and they haven't filled Stark Tower going into turn 5, pretty good chance they might. So if you're looking for a sneaky reactionary play, or maybe like a Juggernaut to push stuff off of Stark Tower so they can't realize the buffs going into turn 5, because that's the last turn they might want to put everything in, some advantages can be gained certainly there, because this is really directing their play. Next up is Starlight Citadel. After turn 4, swap the position of each location. So sometimes this one won't really do much because the locations already had effects that like procced and they're done and they're just kind of sitting there. Other times this can really change things. Say if you had like that Sinister London, for instance, and you're going to save some places for it later to make big plays, Starlight Citadel might come in and move Sinister London into a spot where you already have multiple units and therefore really limit your abilities. You just kind of have to be careful here if you're looking to make big plays off a location that could be disrupted by this. Just be really mindful. Can be hard to predict. Sometimes it might not be worth it to hold off. You might just be up to the fate of a Marvel Snap, as is often the case, but you just have to be really mindful of how wrong things can go. You could even try to make some like heads up plays where you're playing something in a spot it wouldn't normally belong and then hope a location swings into it that's advantageous and then really throw your opponent for a loop with a big surprise play. But you know, that's essentially a 50-50 because it's one of the other two locations that'll swap into that spot, so just be careful. Moving on to Strange Academy. At the end of turn 5, move all cards here to other random locations. So clearly some move synergies. If you have those in your deck, that could be a great way to proc some additional move upside. But beyond that, this is one you just have to be really mindful again of positioning, because I've seen a lot of people commit stuff to Strange Academy and then all 3 units will move that they've committed to Strange Academy and they'll lock out another location entirely, and sometimes in a really inconvenient way where they have a very limited power at a location, and because you haven't overcommitted to Strange Academy leading into turn 5, then you can just win that location really easily because they've locked out their spots, and so on. So just, you know, don't overcommit. Maybe moving 1 or 2 things here, as long as you have a couple open spots at other locations and you don't lock yourself out, that can work fine. There's no need to necessarily avoid this altogether depending on the game state, but just got to be really careful. Next up, we have Subterranea, and yeah, this is one of the most frustrating locations in Marvel Snap because it shuffles 5 rocks into each deck, and indeed you can draw 4 rocks in a row, as happened to me yesterday. But that's really what you need to do for Subterranea, I think, to gain an edge, is recognize that when the shuffle's in, it's usually going to be a little less than half of your deck. Sometimes it could actually even be up to or more than half of your deck at that stage. So if after 4 turns you've drawn 3 out of 4 rocks, that's more than you would expect to on average, and it's more than your opponent will likely have drawn at the same time. So they might have a natural advantage having more cards than you. Hard to know exactly because you can't see how many rocks they have unless they've played them all. And it's only a small difference, but still noteworthy that if you've only drawn 1 out of 4 rocks, you probably have a much higher quality hand than your opponent. Might give you a little bit of an edge. You might be expected to win in that turn 6 scenario, because they might just be hitting rocks at that stage, or maybe 1 or 2 more than you, missing some of their key cards. I just think if you keep that in mind, that if more than half my draws have been rocks, I might not be in the best spot necessarily. Be ready to retreat in those scenarios. Next up here is the Big House. 4, 5, and 6 cost cards can't be played here. So this is really a battle of low cost units. If either player is running a deck where they don't have a lot of low cost stuff, maybe they're just playing some heavy hitting late game cards, this might be a hard one to win, and you got to keep that in mind. This is also one you just kind of have to pay attention to. Sometimes I forget, like, oh man, they're going to play an Odin here. They're going to play an Odin here. And then, no, of course not. They can't play an Odin here. I don't have to worry about that. So just double checking your logic every time you're going into late game scenarios for Big House, realizing that they have probably limited options here. Also keep in mind that it looks at original cost of cards for something like this. So even if things have been discounted, but they started at 4, 5, or 6, they still won't be able to be played at the Big House. So just don't forget about that. Next up, we have the Hub. Add a random card to each player's hand. And this one's really not typically an enormous impact in my experience. Sometimes you'll get a card that just fits in perfectly and that can give you a great advantage. But on average, you know, it's going to be a wash for card quality. And it's hard to net a real notable advantage in this case. Just if you get a home run, you know, don't be scared to snap on that nice little gain. Or if your opponent's got stuff like hand buffs, for instance, can be better for them to have multiple cards. Or if they have a really synergistic deck where they're looking to do something specific and combo-y, it's less likely that the Hub is good for them. If you have more of a general use deck, just looking to get some stats and power and low cost units, might be more likely that the Hub is advantageous for you. Moving on to the Space Throne. Only 1 card can be here for each player. So of course, sometimes this will wreck people because they played a Squirrel Girl and they got a squirrel in this position. So, you know, sometimes that could be a free win because you don't have to commit much there to the Space Throne. Other times, of course, if they played multiple things in Space Throne before it revealed, if they blindly dropped in that location spot, they can keep multiple cards there, right? So it can be a way to snipe a little bit of an advantage on Space Throne, and you will feel a little bit ripped off, but that's just how it goes. The other thing to keep in mind is this really locks down board spaces. You go from 12 to 9 with Space Throne, so whoever's playing a deck that goes really wide with low-cost units might have trouble getting enough power into play. They might be stuck on cards they can't really dump. So if you have a higher power per position sort of deck, you might be able to do more when Space Throne's in play. Moving on to the Super Flow. If you have no cards here, +1 energy each turn. So of course this adds a little bit of ramp to both players as long as they're not committing cards. Normally most people keep this one open for as long as reasonable. You know, if you only have 5 mana worth of cards you're expecting on turn 6, you don't really need Super Flow, for instance. You're going to have extra mana anyway. So sometimes it's fine to commit here if you know you're going to be able to play your cards regardless. But if you want to cheat out some bigger stuff, of course, that could be nice. If you're like a Jubilee deck or a Mr. Negative deck that has a big mid-game play, this can really help you net an advantage a little bit sooner. And I will say sometimes this is one that's really good to snipe with something like Professor X, because your opponent is like trying to realize this benefit. If you could put a Professor X in and lock this down, it's often very open pretty late into the game and allows you to get this one for free. And usually losing that energy over your opponent over the next turn or two or whatever is not such a loss that a free location isn't worth it. Moving on to the Vault. On turn 6, cards can't be played here. So this is another one where you're probably going to be contesting this one pretty heavily on turn 5, trying to get units in. But again, do keep in mind, cards can still be added here on turn 6. So they can be played, but if your opponent has some way to move something into this position or just summon a unit in a different location, then it's still possible for you to get sniped here on the Vault. Another mistake I've made myself a couple times is that if you're a Limbo deck, don't forget that you can actually still play things on turn 7 on the Vault. I've actually made that mistake where it's not after turn 6. It's not permanently locked out. It's only locked out on exactly turn 6, which normally feels definitive and, you know, at the end of the game. But when there's a turn 7, you can go back to the Vault again. Don't forget, like I have. Next up here is Tinkerer's Workshop, +1 energy this turn. And this is rarely a really important location in my experience. You know, some decks like to play higher cost things, might net a little bit of an advantage here, playing out some bigger stuff a turn sooner, swinging the game a little earlier, getting a combo like Mr. Negative and play a turn sooner can help a little, but generally not a big difference. Just keep in mind who netted a bigger advantage off of Tinkerer's Workshop. If your opponent completely floats mana, you know, multiple mana, or misses an entire turn despite the Tinkerers, that can give you some information, but otherwise not usually too impactful. Next up here is Titan. 6 cost cards cost 1 less. So just a nice discount for decks that go deep into 6 cost cards. Most don't really go that hard into 6 cost cards right now in Marvel Snap metas anyway, but there's always that random America Chavez. And if your opponent is running like a really greedy deck, running multiple 6 drops, of course they can get kind of 2 heavy high-powered plays in a row on turn 5 and 6. So that can be spooky. Keep that in mind, but rarely, I think, a mega impactful location. Next up is TVA, one of the craziest locations in Marvel Snap. At the end of turn 4, end the game. So this one's really just a race to see who can get the most stuff in play by turn 4. If you're a deck that doesn't have a lot of low-cost cards that can go across multiple locations, you probably want to go wide in this scenario to contest each location if you can. You're probably just screwed. I've played decks that literally didn't have anything to do until turn 4. Obviously, you're not going to win in that case, so do not be scared to retreat if you think you're hopeless here for TVA. I think one thing that helps, though, from a perspective standpoint is it doesn't take much to win. Sometimes literally 1 power might be enough to win a location because your opponent might just not have a lot of cards to play. They might only be able to play like 2 things, contest 2 lanes. That 1 power on that 3rd lane might just be enough. So just set your expectations. Remember, there aren't going to be a lot of stats in play, not a lot to contest here. So you might be surprised just how often you win with very, very small numbers here by turn 4. Moving on to Wakanda. Cards here can't be destroyed. They can be great if you have cards that are normally targets for being destroyed. Think about something like a Sunspot, for instance, that's killable by Elektra or Killmonger. Plop it down in Wakanda, you know it's going to be safe from being destroyed. So easily that can be a nice little shield. Also, this is one that just demands you pay attention. I've honestly forgotten so many times, like, oh, I'm going to Shang-Chi, their giant thing in Wakanda. I can't. It whiffed because it's just kind of sleepy sitting there for most of the game. You're not really thinking about it. By the time you get to turn 6, you kind of forget. Just constantly refresh and pay attention on this one because it can catch you a little off guard. Wakandan Embassy gives +2 power to cards in players' hands. So this one's really just about noting who has a big hand. If your opponent's already played 3 things by the time this pops and you haven't played anything, might be a huge advantage for you. That could be a +6 net that could help you win a game. Also, keep in mind, how well do you utilize those stats? An Iron Man getting buffed off Wakandan Embassy, for instance, is going to do a lot better than other cards getting buffed because he's naturally doubling it. If you have things that scale stats, that's going to give you an extra edge here with this one. Washington, D.C. cards here with no abilities have +3 power. So this doesn't pop up too often. Most decks aren't hard running cards with no abilities, but there are certainly things that summon things with no abilities. And if you have a few of those in your deck, like Squirrel Girl summoning a squirrel, suddenly that's a 4 power squirrel instead of a 1 power squirrel. That can be a really nice change. So if this is ever like a featured location, of course, you can build decks really specifically for that. If you happen to have a Patriot deck that's doing that anyway, man, you're probably in hog heaven. Otherwise, there's not usually too much difference here because most decks, at least right now, aren't exactly utilizing this synergy. Weird World. Both players draw from their opponent's decks. And this one's pretty crazy. And as far as like the strategy behind Weird World, it's really just about trying to figure out what cards you're going to be likely to get as soon as you can and how well those are going to position you into the late game. So if you draw like 2 straight 1 energy cards, you're saying, okay, my opponent's deck is pretty low curve. I'm pretty likely to draw something small and weak. Maybe I'm not going to have a powerful turn 6. And if they snap going into that, you can say, well, look, I'm not going to be able to contest on turn 6. I know my deck has big, awesome stuff. They're going to have some bombs, some crazy things. I might be in a tough spot. Also, just keep in mind the number of original cards you have in your deck at the time this goes off, because it could be, you know, turn 3 or turn 1, how likely those are to kind of fuel your game plan themselves. Do they give you enough to get by, or do you need more? How reliant are you going to be on your opponent's deck? Just a lot of considerations to make, but really it's a lot of thinking in the fly, making decisions just based on what your expectations are. So this one probably comes down a lot to meta knowledge. Knowing what deck list looks like, what you're likely to encounter, can be a huge advantage here. Westview turns into a new location on turn 4. So this is kind of just like a delayed location flip. I don't actually find this one particularly compelling, to be honest. It's the same thing locations do normally, but just a turn later, which does actually kill some locations' utility. Some things like have turn 3 activations that just don't do anything when Westview happens. So on average, this is actually kind of a dead location more than most. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're less location dependent or sort of synergy agnostic in your deck. It might be a benefit to see something like Westview on average, but it's very small differences and incremental gains there. But I guess there's also some logic about sort of where the power band of your deck lies. If you have crazy powerful spiky things happening later in the game, you might be able to better utilize a surprise location like Westview as opposed to an opponent who's developing and setting things up early in the game. If they've got Angelas and Bishops down, a lot of their power is already committed by the time Westview pops, and it could really disrupt things or change things or deny them opportunities. Whereas if you have a lot of things happening late in the game, maybe you're better able to utilize that. Again, really hard to predict and guess, but if I had to force a strategy thought, it'd perhaps be in that direction. So next up is World Ship, destroy the other locations. This is one I've only seen like 3 times in countless hours of Marvel Snap so far, so don't worry about this one too much. It is a super duper rare one. But yeah, it's really just about where you're at when this lands and what deck you're playing. If you have a higher power per position than your opponent's deck, if you can drop, 7, 8 power things per every turn, and your opponent's capping out at 4 or 5 power things, obviously you're going to be favored. So if you're playing into this blind and you've already played a few 1 power things, probably best to just retreat. It's going to be all your opponent. But yeah, just play it by ear. But this one's pretty dang crazy. Moving on here to Xandar. Cards here have +1 power, so slight advantage here to decks that can swarm a little more. Playing more units here obviously nets you more bonuses, but not a huge difference. It's +4 total. If you have things that scale stats like Iron Man, maybe that's a little bit better for you on average, but ultimately a pretty small difference. The important thing to do is just remember it for math, right? These are the ones I tend to let slip. Just keep that in mind. This is a 3 power unit, but it's gonna be 4. Add 4 to the number, Regis. Don't add 3. Next up here is X Mansion. At the end of turn 3, add a random card here for each player. And this one's just all RNG. If your opponent gets the Infinite and you get Nightcrawler, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. That said, that happened to me. I'm using that example specifically because I still won that game, right? There are still ways to lose, even if you get a giant swing on X Mansion. So is it worth a snap? Usually if you net like 8 to 10 bonus power over your opponent, probably so. That puts you in a huge lead, but don't necessarily give up. If you got a Shang-Chi in there, right, things can still go your way. So again, as always, play it by ear and snap carefully. So moving on here, these are a little bit out of alphabetical order, but that's because these would have been in the previous video by alphabetical order, but these were more recently added to the game since I did the last video, and I'm sure I'll do a video again in the future sometime because new locations are being added all the time. But this is Asgard. After turn 4, whoever is winning here draws 2 cards. So this one was pretty hotly contested while it was in rotation. People were going really hard to draw the 2 cards. Sometimes I think maybe overcommitting a little. Often, most decks are structured in a way where 2 cards doesn't really offer you a lot of total extra power. It perhaps offers you a little bit of extra choice. But I know for me, I was playing a Mr. Negative deck where having 2 cards post Mr. Negative was actually a huge upside. So there are ways to utilize this in some pretty sneaky ways. And if that happens, if you see your opponent wins this with a Mr. Negative down, for instance, they're going to be drawing some very highly powered things. You need to absolutely proceed with caution. Next up is Atalan. On turn 4, shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 3 cards. So this one's all about just resources and making sure you want to maintain as much card advantage as you can. So for instance, if you have a 0 card hand, you're still going to draw 3 cards. That's a net gain of 3. If you have a 5 card hand when this goes off, guess what? You're losing 2 cards of card advantage. So as much as you can, emptying your hand into the Atalan switch will be a nice way to get more total options and things into play. But I would say be careful. Don't totally mess up synergies or show your hand too much by giving your opponent enormous informational advantages just to net a few extra cards. Like I said, cards are good. We love drawing cards, but sometimes you don't need 6 cards when 4 cards will do the job just fine if you're making bad plays in order to get to that scenario. So next up we have Death's Domain, which is actually what Nowhere used to say. So I wanted to include both of these, even though we talked about the old Nowhere, or what is now Death's Domain, in part 1. If you want to learn more about that, feel free to watch part 1. But now Nowhere says on reveal effects do not happen at this location. So this one's just one of those where you got to be mindful. Don't forget about it. There's a lot of cards that don't seem like on reveal cards that still are. Just pay attention closely. And if you have a deck that's very reliant on reveal effects, this one can hurt you a lot. So don't be afraid to retreat if your opponent pressures you with a snap. And then finally here we have Lemuria. No cards are revealed this turn. So this one can be a little bit sneaky and sometimes frustrating. If you have an on-reveal effect, you want to get down as soon as possible. You got the Okoye and you want to buff your deck, but Lemuria blocks it, so the next card you draw is not buffed. That's a pretty minimal example, but obviously those sorts of things can happen. There are ways for this to backfire. You can also use it as a little bit more of a surprise. Buy yourself some time before your opponent kind of knows your game plan or what is up, because they won't even see what the card is. It's literally not even shown. It's not just that on reveal effects are delayed. Just keep in mind that on the next turn, when you play additional cards, they will still reveal in the initial order. So the thing you played, say if this pops on turn 3, will reveal first, and then the stuff you played on turn 4 will reveal next. You can still kind of keep the procedural line going if you want, but just sometimes the on reveal will be delayed by a turn. And there you have it. That's it for part 2 of my Marvel Snap locations guide. Man, there are a lot of these and a lot to get through, but you know, I think it's nice for people who haven't even played the game yet just to get familiar with these, understand some of the game plans and strategies around these. Also just nice for me to talk through these, learning more about you know, what to think about all of these different locations, how to play through them all, little tips and tricks. That said, I'm sure there'll be more of these in the future because Marvel Snap keeps releasing new locations. Might be a while for enough to get gathered up for another video, but stay tuned for that and additional Marvel Snap videos in the future as the game gets into more people's hands. Kind of taking things slow right now for Marvel Snap, but I'm sure in the future when the game goes to a wider release, I'll do lots more content. But thanks so much for watching. Share any tips or tricks you have for these locations in the comments below, and until next time, game on.